Sponsored by Taylor Freelance, Rainier Ballistics, Hodgson Powders, and JPL Precision.
Hey Power Factor fans, I'm Rick, and welcome to this special AM edition of Power Factor Show. We made it to the range finally. I know you used to see me here in my garage, but we have had some beautiful weather the last couple of days. Made it to the range on Thursday, specifically to wrap up the loading to the max and high pressure cartridges segment that we did earlier. The loading to the max revolved around my seeking 1200 feet per second with a 230 grain bullet in 45 Super. And then I also was going to run some vintage Norma 10mm factory ammo through my 10mm Delta Elite. And the point of the two tests is that the 45 Super is based on the 45 Auto cartridge dimensionally, but it runs at about 50% higher pressure. And so the gun that you're shooting that cartridge in is a 45 ACP gun originally that is modified to accommodate the higher pressures. So you're essentially, it's almost like a wildcatting situation where you're having to modify your gun to accommodate this higher pressure cartridge. And the cartridge, again, the normal pressure for 45 Auto is about 20,000 PSI. 45 Super is running at 28,000, which is not really high pressure when you figure 9mm, 40, 10mm all run at about 35 to 40,000. 28,000 isn't all that high, but again, it's almost 50% more than normal for 45 Auto. And we're loading very hot. I mean, a typical 45 Auto load, factory hardball ammo is going to be a 230 grain bullet at 830 feet per second, maybe 850. 230 grain self-defense ammo is going to be up close to 900, but we're talking driving that same bullet at 1200 feet per second, and so we're pretty close to the edge. I mean, I was pretty conscious of pressure signs and other things that we went over in those earlier episodes. How far is the gun ejecting? Like when I tested the 45 Super gun after I'd made the modifications to it and fired my old major power loads through it, it wouldn't even eject those because the respringing and stuff that I'd done, the firing pin stop and whatnot modifications I'd made specifically to slow down the slide velocity and whatnot, it was effective enough that my major power loads wouldn't even function in the gun. So I was interested to see, how does the gun function? Am I seeing pressure signs? And what kind of velocities can we get? And then with the 10mm, it was sort of the same issue of we're using an unsupported chamber in both the Delta Elite and the 45 Super. Got an example here. This is actually the barrel that used to be in the 45 Super gun. This is just a standard 45 Auto barrel, and you can see that the throat here runs pretty much from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock, fairly deep funnel, and when you put a case in there, you get an idea of how much of the brass is unsupported by the chamber. So the concern is, when you're running this gun at 20,000 PSI, you've got that much unsupported brass. But then when you're using that same barrel running at 50% higher pressures, that's not focusing for some reason. There we go. Running at 50% higher pressures, and the cartridge case, of course, is designed to accommodate it. But you're running right at the edge, and so for instance, the max load that I was running was 13.5 grains of AA number 7. And AA number 7 is a fairly slow burning powder for pistol use, and it's the one that I use to make 1200 feet per second in 10mm. So we're kind of running those two cartridges very similarly in terms of powder burn rate and whatnot, and looking for the same signs. And here's a couple of the 45 Super cases. As you can see, we were discussing flattened primers, and the primers look pretty good, but you can see that the one case has a little bit of a distinct firing pin drag on it. The one here in my left hand, you can see that just a little bit of an elongation of the firing pin strike, and I suspect that this case was one of the higher pressure rounds when I was getting up towards 13.5 grains, and this one was one of the lower pressure rounds down around 12 grains, because our primer is not quite as flattened. The firing pin mark is not as distinct, but if you if you're looking for pressure signs, you want to look at that unsupported part of the case, the part that's hanging out of the over the feed ramp. And you can see a dent in the case. That's from where the case came out on ejection and tagged the edge of the ejection port, and virtually every case has that mark on it. Where is it on this one? Oh, and that's another interesting thing. The one that I've identified as being one of the lower pressure rounds, probably 12 grains of powder rather than 13 grains, based on the lack of the firing pin mark, drag mark. You also don't see that heavy dent from the ejection port. There's a slight dent right there, but I think those are both signs that this is one of the lower pressure rounds, probably closer to the 12 grain of powder end of things, and this one was probably up at the 13 and a half grains. So we have both the exaggerated firing pin drag mark and the exaggerated mark from hitting the ejection port on the way out. And even so, the cases were not ejecting all that far. I mean, that's one of the things that's characteristic I've found of the Delta Elite pistol. I've got mine, and my buddy John also brought his, is even with mid-range 10mm loads, the Delta Elite will usually eject the cases 12 to 15 feet. And so it's not unusual full power loads to have those cases really flying. And even the nearly 1,200 foot per second loads that I was firing out of the Super, cases were only ejecting 6 or 8 feet. So that's a good sign. The slide velocity isn't real high because those cases just aren't ejecting all that far. But there are signs that we're running pretty hot. And I'll post the measurements, case head expansion measurements, to the Facebook page. You can take a look there. But essentially what I'll be looking for is comparing this area of the case just forward of the extractor groove, measuring the diameter of the case right there and comparing it to the loaded round to see how much the case has expanded. Because when you fire, of course, the case expands to seal against the walls of the chamber, and then it retracts again slightly. So the fired case is always going to be slightly larger than an unfired case, but we still want to see how much is it expanding specifically in this area here that's unsupported by the chamber wall, and that's a good pressure indicator. You'll see people talking about their cases have a smiley mark, and it'll be kind of a crescent-shaped bulge in the case as pressures start to get to the dangerous level. And just looking at these with the famous Mark II eyeball, I'm not seeing much expansion here. So even though this one I believe was one of the higher pressure loads, I'm not seeing any distinct bulges or marks in this unsupported part of the case. So I think that was a good sign. It was safe. We weren't running our cases right at the edge, and I saw some good velocities. That was the thing I was complaining about, my initial set of loads using Ramshot Enforcer powder. Even a max charge of Enforcer powder wasn't even getting those 230 grain bullets up to 1,000 feet per second. So I did the test over again, same bullets, same cases, but I substituted AA number 7, which is a powder again that I've had good success with in 10mm, and the velocities were right where I wanted them. I started out with a 12 grain load. Those were about 1,000 feet per second, progressed up to 12, 12 and a half, 12.7, up to 13 and a half, I believe. And those suckers, the fastest one ran at 1189, which is right where I wanted to see it. Yeah, 13. Oh, these are the Enforcer loads. 13 and a half grains got me up to 1189 peak velocity, and average was about 1170. And I did the power factor calculation on that. I think it's 270 power factor. So it's pretty powerful load. I can't see exactly what I would use the cartridge for. I had this fantasy some years ago about going pig hunting. There were news reports every day that hordes of wild pigs were migrating across the United States, and we'd be inundated with hogs, and it never happened. I mean, we heard, some buddies and I were talking about, we heard, oh yeah, there's no limit pig hunting out on the Olympic Peninsula. And one of my friends went out there, did a little recon, drove around. People are going, oh yeah, well, my neighbor saw a pig a few years ago, so this idea that, the pigs are going to be running wild in the street, and I'll be out there with my 45 Super, saving humanity. That was the fantasy. Didn't turn out that way. I've never seen a wild pig. But if I did, I'd want that 45 Super. And so the experiment I thought was great on the 45 Super side. no pressure signs, everything went safe, the gun performed. One thing that did come up was kind of interesting. We've had some series about magazines, magazine springs, loads that are suitable for certain guns. And one of the things that came up is I had 2 last round feed failures. And you can see how this cartridge got pinched in the ejection port. It was essentially like a nose up, I don't know if that's going to focus, a nose up stovepipe kind of effect. And it was just a matter of the slide was moving so fast that, or so violently, that the magazine was not able to keep up. And so if I loaded, the next time, even though I increased the powder charge, the next step in the progression, I loaded 7 rounds in the mag, shot only 5 of them so that there would be more spring pressure even on the last round, the 5th round of the 7, and I didn't have any more malfunctions even as I continued to increase the velocities. So one of the issues, and of course it was stupidly the magazine that I brought was an old flush fit 8-round mag, which, as we've discussed before, has a kind of a compromised spring in it because you're trying to fit 8 rounds into a 7-round tube. So that was my own fault. I should have suspected that was going to happen. If I brought a conventional 7-round mag or one of the 8-round competition mags that's got more spring in it, I probably wouldn't have had any issues. But as soon as I saw that stovepipe, I just thought, well, I brought the wrong mag. And actually, I conceived what I called my super mag, which is a 7-round magazine tube with a 10-round magazine spring in it. And the mag, or if it's an 8-round follower, it'll only hold 7 rounds, but there's a lot more spring in there, and that's the mag I should have brought with me because I'm thinking, okay, the mag is going to have a hard time keeping up with the slide. But that was the only malfunction I had, is I had 2 of these that got stuck in the port, pinched between the barrel and the breech face, and then as soon as I started loading 7 to shoot 5, the problem went away. Other than that, perfect function, good consistent 6 to 8 foot ejection. So very practical in that sense, that it's not, I wasn't treading dangerously to get my 1,200 feet per second. But again, I'm just not really sure why. What am I going to do with it other than just produce this exciting episode of Power Factor Show for you, my fans. Now the 10mm thing, that was a huge disappointment. I had built it up in my mind that the 10mm cartridge, as it was conceived, was a full power cartridge. There was nowhere to go, no up from full power. But there are a lot of boutique manufacturers now that are making really high performance 10mm loads, and some of them are saying don't shoot these in your Delta Elite. They'll be, we don't advise that they be shot in the Delta Elite precisely because it has the unsupported chamber. And I thought, well, the Delta Elite was designed to accommodate full power 10mm ammo with its unsupported chamber. So if you can't shoot it in the Delta Elite, it's something wrong with the ammo, not something wrong with the gun. Your specifications for the ammo are outside, either outside SAAMI specs, or the cartridge has been modified in some way that I'm unaware of that makes it dangerous. But I just thought, okay, I'm going to shoot these factory loads, a little trip through yesteryear, but also just kind of like, okay, it is not dangerous to shoot full power 10mm through an unsupported chamber. So I dragged out one of my boxes of vintage Norma ammo, made back in the 1980s, and back in the 80s, this is the only 10mm ammo there was. So when the Delta Elite was designed, it was for this cartridge, and I got my buddy John to come along. He brought his Delta Elite, so a couple of late 80s examples of the Delta Elite design. Got the chrono set up, I marked the cartridges, I measured the case heads and the case mouths, to see if there's going to be any dangerous expansion. Fired the first shot and it went 970 feet per second. I would have been less surprised if it went 1270. There was been a lot of discussion about how the early Norma ammo was not very consistent, little kind of wild fluctuations in velocity. 1200 is supposed to be where it's supposed to go, but I've heard talk that some of it went a little bit hotter than that. So 970, I fired my 10 shots. One of them, I think, exceeded 1,000 feet per second. So my conclusion is at some point in its 30-year lifespan, the ammo was stored in an attic in Phoenix or something. It deteriorated to the extent that the quest for pressure I just don't think is going to be there. And again, I'll mic the cases, and if anything interesting shows up, I'll post it to the Facebook page. But the Delta Elite side of things, it was fun. We had a good time. John and I got to put some rounds through our Deltas, but the idea of it being a test of high pressure and can the gun withstand these high pressures, that side of the story had to be confined to the 45 Super, where it actually had some high performance rounds for it. But it was a fun time anyway. I don't get the Delta out as much as I should. But that's just kind of the end of the story. Loading to high pressures, be safe, be careful, but you can get some good performance within the confines of the recommended loads, target velocities. You don't need to go crazy. I see a lot of people, oh yeah, I got my 45 Super, I got a 230 grain bullet up to 1,400 feet per second. And I'm like going, okay, well, that's the guy that they're going to be calling lefty in a few years after he blows his gun up. So be mindful of what the cartridges are supposed to do. And if you need considerably better ballistics than that, get a bigger gun. I mean, if I thought my 10mm loads, 200 at 1200, wasn't going to get done whatever I needed done, I wouldn't just load it hotter. I'd go get a 41 Magnum or something and start over again, build up from there. So be safe, have a good time. Watch those pressure signs, but don't be afraid. It's a bit of art, but it's also, there's science involved. So just be smart about it and have a good time.
And we're here at the range, special occasion. We are at Interlake Sporting Association. And this is actually where I got my start in practical pistol competition. Back in '97, this was my home range. This is where Northwest Practical Pistol Association was founded in the 70s and continued to shoot here till about 2000. And I was a member here at one time many years ago, but we're here today for kind of to finish up the loading to the max, loading for high pressure, stuff that we got started in earlier episodes. And one of the things that I wanted to do was shoot some Norma factory 10mm ammo through my Delta Elite. So let's see how it goes. Oh, there it is, in all of its glory. Look at that, look at that. I'd hate to blow it up with this high-powered ammo. So I bought this gun in 1999. Those of you who are in the gun business, interested in guns, an article came out, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, that said Colt is not going to sell guns to the public anymore. And technically, Colt hadn't sold guns to the public for years. They sell to distributors who then sell to the public. But the story got out in the news, and the day that newspaper hit the newsstands, I ran down to my local gun store, and this is the only Colt that they had, so I bought it. And I've probably put, I don't know, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 rounds through it over the years, but most of the rounds that I've put through it have been of what I call Cooper's intent power factor. Cooper's vision for the 10mm cartridge was a 200 grain bullet at 1,000 feet per second. That's mostly what I shoot, but today, again, in the interest of scientific investigation, we're going to go with the full power loads. Now, my buddy John, he also has his Delta Elite, and his, I think, is a little bit more stock than mine. I've had a Bomar rear sight on mine, and a bushing change, and a beaver tail, and some whatnot on it. John's gun is pretty stock, but it's from the same era, the first generation guns that were made in the late 80s. So should be a couple of prime examples of period guns, period ammo, and we'll see how it goes. 23-pound factory recoil spring, actually a dual spring. There we go. Oh boy, the anticipation. Here we go. John's back there to catch the brass. .987. That doesn't seem very impressive. Let's try it again. .976. I don't think that's right. 995. .980. Recoil is plenty stout. 1007. It's kind of a disappointment. I don't know if we have a problem, a gun problem, ammo problem. We fired some 38 super rounds over the chrono to make sure the chrono was working, and those rounds chronoed right in the window where we expected, 130 grains at 126 power factor. So I don't know why these are moving so slowly, but let's try it again. Ready? Fire in the hole, fire in the hole, fire in the hole. .901, 962, 980, 980. Well, that is hugely disappointing. Plated 180, jacketed 180, 10 grains of number 7. So this should be another Colonel Cooper favorite, about 1,000 feet per second, maybe a little more. Oh, that was snappy. 1056. 1063. 1074. 1025. Is that an owl or something in the tree there? Oh yeah. This is like a nature preserve here. I've seen salamanders and frogs and stuff that I usually don't see anywhere.
Wow.
That's pretty cool. This is a custom Caspian single stack that I used to shoot in limited 10 division, and I've made some modifications to it, springs, cool firing pin stop, just to better suit it to the higher pressures, higher recoil energy. So we'll load it up, see what happens. I mean, see what good things transpire. 12 grains of number 7. Oh yeah. 1057, 1096, woohoo, 1086, 1095, 1109. 1109. Okay, we're on the right track. Let's try, just for the heck of it, let's try let's try 12.2 grains. Here's a couple of our cases here. See if that camera will focus on there. The primer is, it's a little flattened maybe, but it's not, you know, it's not, normally when you're concerned about it being flattened is when the rounded edges of the primer are completely squared off. And you can see these, they're flattened, but the edges are still rounded. You can still see, you know, that the primer's not deformed really, and we have a nice round firing pin strike. There's no distinct tail on it indicating that the firing pin is dragging. There's a little bit of a divot right there, but it's not a heavy drag mark. So that one's a little heavier. That one's a little bit more of a drag mark on there. You can just see it right there. So we're going to try next step in the load range and see how it goes. 1128, 1143, 1129, whew, 1142. Oh, what did I get? Okay, there we go. We've got our first malfunction. So we had a live round stovepipe on the last round. And so we're just starting to get into the zone, I think, here where the gun is just kind of outrunning itself. The magazine's having a hard time keeping up, or the magazine is just not retaining the rounds sufficiently. Maybe that was an inertia feed situation. So we'll just go one more step in the progression here. So this should be 13 grains. If we get through this, I think we're going to stop. And I'll measure some case heads and whatnot before we get to the max load. So here we go. This should be, I think, 13 grains of number 7. I'm going to hold on to it a little tighter this time too. $11.64, $11.42, $11.19, $11.54, and another last round failure to feed. So I think we're starting to get to the limit of what the magazine is capable of doing. 8-round mag. The last round is clearly not being held securely in the mag. It's getting away from the feed lips, so that's probably an inertia situation. And we're using the old tapered feed lip mags. And as I've related in prior episodes, I've had some issues with the tapered feed lip mags. And inertia problems, inertia feed, and the rounds getting out of the case just a little prematurely. So I think that maybe is going to be the end of that. I don't think I have any. I think all these mags are tapered feed lip mags. I know what we're going to do. Since it's a last round issue, we're going to stoke up the mag and not fire all of the rounds. So I'm going to load 7, and we'll shoot 5, and we'll see if we don't get adequate function here. It's just the typical, you hear about how 8-round mags can't quite keep up. The spring isn't as strong. These shouldn't suffer. This mag is a conventional 8-round in a 7-round tube. So I think that's probably the issue. If I had a real 8-round mag, extended tube style mag, it would probably help. So here we go. This is going to be the last for the day. See if we can hit 1,200 feet per second. $11.59, $11.49, $11.37. Seems like they're getting slower. $11.52, $11.51. Should we go for it? Okay, here's our cases. Primer, little more evidence of flattening. The corners are a little more square than they were. I'm still not seeing much of a firing pin drag mark on there. There is a little bit, but I'm not upset about it. Just eyeballing the case, I'm not seeing a bulge. I'm not seeing that the cases are bulging where the case is least supported in this area. So it doesn't look like there's we're reaching dangerous pressure. So I'm going to go ahead and go for it. I'm going to go ahead and go for the max load, 13.5 grains. See how it goes. Going for broke. Oh man, that spring. That's what you get with a 27-pound mainspring and a 24-pound recoil spring. $11.89. $11.82. $11.81. $11.51. $11.55. Wow, got pretty close. Back to the primers. You can see they look like they're in pretty good shape. Again, looking for evidence of a bulge. Not seeing it. I am getting a dent in the cases here, and I think that's on the ejection, hitting the edge of the ejection port on the way out. Most of the cases have that, and I'm not too concerned about that. There's a little ding on that one. But again, I'm not seeing anything in the way of a distinct bulge or a smiley, as people describe it. You get kind of a crescent-shaped bulge if you're bulging your brass from pressure, and I'm not seeing that. So pretty close to exactly what I wanted. I think the fastest one was 11.89, and that's pretty much what I was expecting. Looks like the brass survived, I survived, gun survived. So loading near the max, there we are, can be done. Won't blow anything up if you do it carefully. And I will mic some of these, and I'll report K-stat expansion just to see, you know, how much did it expand. There's always going to be some, but if you start getting more than a couple of thousandths of an inch, time to maybe be concerned. So we'll take a look at that.